The war cruiser Gorax Fong hung motionless in the dark void above Draco Prime, its jagged hull resembling the serrated teeth of the mercenaries who called it home. Inside its steel-boned corridors, laughter rumbled like distant thunder, echoing off the blood-stained walls of the gathering hall. The Dra-Zak, a clan of seasoned killers, were preparing for sport, a ritual they relished. Vorik, their leader, stood at the center of the chamber, his thick-plated armor gleaming under the dim, flickering lights. He raised a clawed hand, silencing the revelry with a mere gesture. His warriors, a motley collection of towering brutes with gnarled flesh and eyes that burned like dying embers, turned their attention to the prisoner kneeling before them. The human, bound at the wrists, barely moved. He was battered but unbroken, his dark gaze locked on the floor as though lost in thought. Even in chains, he was an anomaly, lean but built like a predator, his posture betraying no fear. The Dra-Zak sneered at him with practiced contempt, convinced of their superiority. Vorik stepped closer, tilting his head. "You understand what's happening, don't you?" His voice was a slow, deliberate growl, meant to intimidate. "We will release you onto the surface below. You will run. We will chase you. And when we catch you, we will tear you apart." A ripple of anticipation spread through the mercenaries, their tusk grins widening. They had hunted humans before. Weak creatures, brittle-boned and fragile. The chase never lasted long. The prisoner finally looked up, meeting Vorik's gaze. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his dark eyes. Then, slowly, he smirked. The reaction unsettled some of the Dra-Zak. A low murmur coursed through the room. Vorik narrowed his eyes, but he refused to let doubt creep in. Instead, he stepped back and nodded toward Throg, his second in command. Throg wasted no time. He grasped the human by the arm and yanked him to his feet before marching him toward the launch bay. The rest of the mercenaries followed, their boots thudding against the metal floors. Minutes later, the shuttle carrying the prisoner breached the upper atmosphere of Draco Prime. The planet sprawled below, a savage land of twisted jungle and endless, fog-drenched valleys. It was a place where only the strong survived, where every shadow held something with teeth. Inside the descending craft, the human stared out the viewport. The emerald canopy below pulsed like a living thing, whispering promises of death. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the weight of his restraints. His lips pressed into a thin line. With a metallic hiss, the hatch doors groaned open, and the force of gravity yanked him downward. He plummeted through the humid air, twisting mid-fall, and landed in a crouch upon the damp earth. The restraints fell away. Dante Cade exhaled slowly, flexing his hands. The hunt had begun. Above, the Dra-Zak landed with the grace of seasoned killers, fanning out with the confidence of apex predators. Their advanced optics cut through the jungle's murky twilight, tracking Dante's last known position. Throg's voice crackled through the comms, issuing orders to his squad. "Fan out. Bring him back in pieces." The mercenaries obeyed, laughter dripping from their voices, as they swept into the jungle. Dante was already gone. He moved through the underbrush with practiced efficiency, each footfall a whisper against the forest floor. He knew their type, overconfident, careless, convinced they were the true hunters. He had seen men like them before, and he had buried them. Through the dense foliage, he heard the first of them approach. Heavy footsteps, twigs snapping beneath the weight of arrogance. Dante pressed himself against the thick bark of a nearby tree, his breath steady. The mercenary stomped past him, weapon raised, scanning the trees with heat vision optics. Dante moved, a swift, silent motion. A blade flashed, slicing through the alien's throat, and a single precise arc blood sprayed across the underbrush as the body collapsed. No sound escaped. No alarm was raised. Dante took the alien's weapon and melted back into the darkness. The Dra-Zak had released their prey. They had no idea they had just unleashed a predator. The jungle pulsed with life, a breathing entity wrapped in layers of shadow and tangled growth. Alien insects droned in the distance, their luminescent wings flickering like dying stars. The scent of damp earth and rotting vegetation thickened the air, clinging to the armor of the mercenaries as they prowled forward. Their rifles swept through the darkness, the soft hum of energy cells charging filling the silence between them. Each step was deliberate every movement calculated. They were hunters. They had done this before. Yet something felt wrong. Throg tightened his grip on his weapon, his tusked jaw clenching as he scanned the jungle ahead. The human should have been easy to track. He should have left a trail. Crushed leaves, broken branches, signs of a desperate man running for his life. Instead, the jungle remained eerily undisturbed, as if it had swallowed the prisoner whole. A metallic clang echoed through the trees. The team halted. Weapons snapped upward, fingers tightening over triggers. Throg motioned for two of his men to check the source. They moved swiftly, vanishing into the undergrowth. The others waited, shifting uneasily as the moment stretched thin. A scream split the air, then silence. Throg exhaled sharply through his nostrils. He gestured for the team to fan out. The bodies had to be close. He stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. His visor scanned the foliage, flickering through various vision modes: thermal, night optics, ultraviolet. Shapes shifted in the darkness, branches twisting under the weight of unseen things. Then he saw them. The first body hung from the canopy, limp, a jagged wound carved across its throat. The second was slumped against a tree, his own blade buried in his chest, forced through it in human precision. No signs of struggle, no wasted effort. Throg's blood ran cold. He had underestimated the human. He pressed a button on his gauntlet, activating his communicator. Report. Static. He tried again. Report. The silence mocked him. A rustling to his left. He whirled, rifle raised. Nothing but shifting leaves. The jungle had turned against them. He ground his teeth and gestured for the others to stay close. Their formation tightened, weapons held at the ready. The human was out there, watching, waiting. A shadow moved. One of the mercenaries screamed as something blurred to the foliage. Too fast to track. A wet gurgle followed. Then a body crumpling into the undergrowth. The squad erupted into gunfire, energy bolts cutting to the trees, illuminating the jungle in bursts of red and blue light. The stench of scorched bark filled the air, but when the barrage ended, nothing remained but the swaying leaves and the steady drip of blood. Throg's breathing turned ragged. He had faced countless enemies, warriors, assassins, creatures bred for battle, but none had felt like this. This wasn't prey they were chasing. This was something else, something patient, something built for this. A whisper crackled through his communicator. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." The voice was calm, controlled. It sent a slow, creeping dread down Throg's spine. He turned, scanning the darkness, heart hammering against his ribs. The others stood rigid, their fingers twitching near their triggers. Then, one by one, they began to disappear. The jungle reeked of blood and ozone. The once boastful mercenaries of the Derazak were reduced to whispers in the dark, their confidence shattered, their movements hesitant. Their numbers had dwindled from a dozen to a handful, each death swift, merciless, unseen. Panic had begun to seep into their bones, poisoning their instincts, turning their training into little more than reflexive fear. They weren't hunting anymore. They were being hunted. Throg crouched beside a fallen warrior, eyes locked on the lifeless body. The kill had been surgical, no wasted energy, no room for struggle. The wound, a clean puncture through the base of the skull, spoke of experience beyond the battlefield, a professional's touch. Throg clenched his jaw, the weight of realization settling over him. This was no ordinary human. A glint of metal caught his eye in the dirt. He reached down, fingers brushing against something small, worn smooth from years of use. He lifted it, turning it over in his palm. A dog tag. The alien script translated itself on his visor. The letters burned into his vision. Cade, Dante REAPER-3. Throg's breath caught. He had heard the stories, just as every warrior in the void had. The Reapers weren't soldiers. They weren't even assassins. They were something else entirely. Shadows given purpose, nightmares forged in the crucible of war. Their existence was a whispered legend, a ghost story told in hushed tones. Armies had vanished in their wake. Governments had collapsed. No one truly knew what they were, only that when a Reaper was sent, the mission was already over. Throg looked up, the jungle pressing in around him, the weight of unseen eyes sinking into his skull. He was standing in a graveyard, and the gravedigger was already watching him. A scream split the air. One of the remaining mercenaries flailed backward, clawing at his throat. Blood spurted between his fingers as he toppled to the ground, the crimson pooling at Throg's feet. No gunfire, no sound of struggle, just the dull thud of a body hitting the dirt. Vork's voice exploded through the comms, laced with fury and something dangerously close to fear. Enough! Form up. We are Azak. We do not cower before prey. The mercenaries obeyed, rallying in the center of the clearing, their weapons raised in a trembling circle. Throg swallowed hard, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, only silence. Then the silence spoke. You should have let me die in that cell. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, crackling through their comms, cutting through their nerves like a serrated blade. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. A plasma rifle discharged wildly, its energy bolt carving through the night. Another mercenary turned, wheezing as a blade embedded itself between his ribs, his body crumpling like discarded cloth. The remaining soldiers fired into the trees, their panic painting streaks of color across the darkness. But they were shooting at nothing. A shadow descended upon them. Dante moved like smoke through the chaos, his blade flashing once, twice, blood misting in the damp air. A rifle was wrenched from desperate hands, turned, and fired before its owner could even scream. The mercenaries fought, but it was a battle already lost. Throg barely managed to raise his weapon when something cold pressed against the back of his skull. His breath hitched. He didn't dare turn. The voice behind him was quiet, controlled. Drop it. His fingers went numb. The rifle slipped from his grasp, landing uselessly at his feet. A wet gurgle to his right signaled Vork's last soldier collapsing into the undergrowth. The jungle swallowed the sound whole. Throg closed his eyes. He was the last one left. Throg stood frozen, his heartbeat pounding in his ears like war drums. The cold edge of a blade pressed against the base of his skull, unmoving, patient. His kind prided themselves on fearlessness, on battle hardiness. But this was different. This was not war. This was execution. Dante Cade had dismantled his squad, piece by piece, turning the jungle into his own personal graveyard. Not once had he fired a shot that wasn't deliberate. Not once had he struck without intent. The Azak had come expecting sport. Instead, they had been the ones hunted. The blade eased back just slightly, enough for Throg to breathe, but not enough for him to move. He swallowed hard. If you're going to kill me, do it. His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual arrogance. Silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then the human exhaled, low and controlled. I'm not here to entertain your last wishes. The weight of those words settled over Throg like a suffocating fog. This wasn't personal. Dante wasn't acting out of revenge or anger. He was just finishing the job. That somehow was worse. Throg's mind raced. He could hear Vork somewhere behind him, the warlord's ragged breathing proof that he had survived a massacre. Barely. Vork would not go quietly. He never did. And if there was one thing Throg had learned in his years under the warlord's command, it was that Vork valued his own survival above all else. A sudden movement, the sound of shifting armor, then gunfire. Throg twisted away at the last second as Vork's plasma pistol discharged, the blast searing through the air where Dante had stood a moment before. The human moved like liquid shadow, slipping between the shots, vanishing into foliage before emerging behind Vork. The warlord turned, snarling, his tusks bared in fury. You think you can kill me, human? I have crushed empires. I have bathed in the blood of warriors 10 times your worth. Dante didn't answer. He didn't need to. He lunged, the knife flashing toward Vork's throat. The warlord barely managed to deflect it with his forearm guard, staggering back as he fired another shot. Dante ducked, rolling into the underbrush before snapping up a fallen rifle. The exchange that followed was brutally efficient. Vork fired, Dante sidestepped. Vork swung, Dante weaved beneath the strike. It wasn't just skill, it was calculation. Every move Vork made, Dante had already accounted for. Throg could only watch. A final misstep sealed Vorik's fate. He overcommit on a downward strike, his massive blade embedding into a tree trunk instead of flesh. In the fraction of a second it took him to recover, Dante was already inside his guard. The knife found its mark. Vorik staggered back, a wet, choking sound escaping him. The blade had slid up beneath his rib cage, piercing deep. His massive frame trembled, his fingers grasping at the hilt as though he could pull the inevitable from his body. He dropped to one knee, staring at Dante with something that almost resembled disbelief. The warlord of the Dr. Izak toppled forward, dead before he hit the ground. Silence. Dante exhaled, stepping back, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He wiped the blade clean against his torn sleeve, then finally turned toward Throg. The last mercenary remained on his knees, his rifle forgotten, his hands open at his sides. He did not beg, did not plead. He simply stared at the man who had unmade them all. Dante studied him for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and vanished into the jungle. Throg remained where he was, surrounded by the dead, the weight of survival pressing down on him like a curse.